This is a special session of the Brown Bag today. I'm taking over from Mark Thornton, who couldn't be here today. But we're very honored to have today on with us George Koether, who knew all the greats and socialized with them. Ayn Rand, Henry Hazlitt, and Ludwig von Mises, and very honored to have him here today to be able to speak with us about some of his experiences. He's also responsible for the Mises bust that's out front here. Mr. Koether arranged the entire project and supervised it, and was a benefactor towards it. And also, right now, he's doing the same thing for Professor Rothbard. Unfortunately, he never was able to get actually measured for the bust, so the person who will do it has to do it entirely from pictures. But Mr. Koether is arranging that. Also, he's a great benefactor for the Mises Institute. We're very pleased to have you here today, sir. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. I'm not an economist, as they say, but I'm a journalist economist, and I've often thought of writing a book titled "Some Economists Aren't," because there are some economists teaching in some places I feel confident who don't really know as much about it as I do, but that's your problem. That's what you're going to change. I'll try to confine this entirely to memories of Mises, after which I'll add on memories of Rothbard, because I met Mises first, and as a result of that, that's how I met Rothbard. So one stroke of good luck led to another, and both became very warm friends. And it started when I was working for the Foundation for Economic Education, which at that time was planning to produce a periodical, which has now evolved into the Freeman. And at that time, there was Paul D. Harper there, and Paul Perot, and maybe some others whose names might not mean much to you. But after 6 months there, it was determined that, well, maybe we shouldn't put out a periodical. Should we take advertising or shouldn't we, and so on. It was a problem in entrepreneurial judgment, which was a little bit too much down to earth for the lofty discussions that were taking place at the time. With fellows like Leonard Reed and Baldy Harper, I must say one thing passing quickly on Baldy. He had about 5 of us around a conference table. This is in 1948. And he said, I'm going to ask a question around the table. I want each one of you to give me an answer. What will be the freest country in the world 100 years from now? And one fellow said the United States, another one said Britain, another one said so on. And nobody said what Baldy was going to say. We all looked at him and said, well, what is your answer? And he said, would you believe Russia? That's the kind of a mind Baldy had. He could be right. He could. That doesn't look much like it yet. But well, while I was at the foundation, one eating lunch all alone in the cafeteria, they had taken this old home and turned it into an institute, and what had been a big spacious kitchen they cut up into little dining nooks. And I was in one of these dining nooks alone at a table for 4. And in walked Leonard Reed with a stranger, short man, in fact, a little bit shorter than I am, I think. Completely dressed, not casual, jacket and tie and all that. And Leonard came in, he walked over to the table, he said, George, I'd like to have you meet Dr. Mises. Well, I didn't know whether Dr. Mises was an economist or a medical doctor or what he was. So he said, may we join you for lunch? I said, sure. So Mises is on one side of me and Reed's on the other. And it wasn't, as I later described to a newspaper man who interviewed me I was going to make a talk in my hometown in Connecticut on inflation, and they interviewed me, and he said, well, how did you get this way? And I said, well, it all starts with a young man sitting down with a man named Mises. It was like a physics student sitting down with Einstein for lunch, something akin to that. But it wasn't long into that lunch when I realized I was talking to an intellectual giant. I mean, I was blinded, really. I was bowled over by it. And I guess my interest showed through pretty rapidly, and some of my comments must have pleased him, or questions, or whatever. He said to me in a very, almost, well, I wouldn't say pleading, but in a very inviting way. He said, "Would you like to join my seminar?" And I said, "Oh, you bet I would." He says, "Come to New York University next Tuesday, 7:25. Yes, sir. Okay. Well, I was there. And there's a chap, young guy. I'm about 20 years older than Murray, 19 to be exact, I guess. So here's this young, feisty fellow sitting. I don't think we sat next to each other, except when the thing was over, we sat next to each other on the subway coming up from the seminary. New York University was down, as you know, downtown, and we were riding up the subway together, and Murray and I got talking. And I instantly realized, here's another real smart guy, and a very affable one. And he had some books in his hand. And I said, what are you reading? He says, "There, look at this one. Title, Knox, Our Enemy the State." It's the first book Maury handed me. And later, well, I'll tell you more about Murray later, but as the seminars went on, I not only attended myself, but this is a characteristic, or was a characteristic of Lou Mises. If you showed any interest, he had the time, he had the patience, he didn't disdain even the stupidest person. If the stupidest person asked a question, he would give him an answer in a way that he hoped that this uninitiated could understand. There was nothing haughty about him. He was, for a man of his mind, he was amazingly humble in his manner and very almost bashful in his behavior, especially around ladies. He would welcome my wife, and I took my wife many times, which was a good thing to do, and then she understood the way I was acting. She grabbed on to free market economics pretty well before she passed on. And I took my two sons, and they are ardent Misesians and free market. And one of them, I hope, is sending me some checks now, and if he isn't, I'm going to kick him in the pants. But this was characteristic. Mises was a man who was generous with his mind, very much more so. Then the only contrast I can make is I had attended many meetings of the Mount Tolerance Society, and I wasn't sure where Professor Friedman stood because I'd heard stories. At his last meeting, I was out. Maybe I had to go to the washroom. I was out of the hall, out of the room, and somebody said, "Friedman just said, as far as he's concerned, you can do away with the Federal Reserve." Well, I had never, of course, I haven't read all of Friedman, so. One time I wrote Friedman. I said, "What is your position at this moment on money?" He had been quoted as having favored a discount rate of so and so one time, and another rate another time, somewhat like the fellow up in Harvard, up in Boston. But I got a letter back from Friedman. My position on money is precisely what it always has been, sincerely, something. In other words, I've got a real brush-off answer. Well, I've seen Mises meet very, very ignorant people asking ignorant questions, but he never brushed them off. He was a gentleman, he was courteous, he listened, and took his time, patience, which I think is exceptional for a man with all that brilliance. Now the other thing, he also had a very soft, gentle voice. He never pounded it. He never did a Rothbard. Murray was just the opposite. Because Murray was outgoing and effusive, and Mises was quiet. He'd come into a room and you'd never know one of the greatest minds in economics had entered the room. He wasn't that kind of a man. In the seminar, We had Henry Hazlitt there, Larry Fertig, Percy Graves. We had a very interesting collection of people. I was the only journalist. There was a manufacturer. There was a young Japanese student, Toshio Murata, who has translated this book, I think, into Japanese. He translated Human Action into Japanese. He finished that, I think, about a year, maybe 2 years, a year and a half ago. And prodigious result that you can see coming out of that Mises seminar. I didn't produce anything, but I try to, as Hayek said to us in Oxford, that it's important that we talk to these dealers in second-hand ideas. Well, at that time, I didn't realize that Hayek himself was a dealer in second-hand ideas. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we're all dealing with lots of second-hand ideas. But Mises never threw his weight around except in his books. That's when he threw his weight around. Now, the other characteristics about him that you might be interested in, the seminar room was just about this large, and the table was just about this big, actually. And I was way down the room was oval, and I was way down on the end of the oval, and Mises was in the middle. He's where this gentleman here would be. And he was talking this way and that way. And I didn't know that Mises had a very bad hearing problem. And that's the one thing, one touch of vanity that he had. He didn't want anybody to know that he couldn't hear very well. He had a hearing aid, but he didn't even want to, he was a little embarrassed about it, you know. So I'd ask a question or make a comment, and his habit was to tell from his prodigious memory. He would make a point of economic theory, and then he would say, for example, then he'd go into an anecdote from the Napoleonic Wars, or the Salt War, the Potato War in Austria, or some incident in history to but to characterize the point he was trying to make. And then he would finish his little narrative, then he'd stop, and he'd look around the table, and waiting for somebody. Well, everybody was so overawed by this man's mind. There were very few people who would speak up. Even Hazlitt, although Hazlitt remained silent largely out of deference to the rest of us in the room, give the rest of them a chance, you know. And Hazlitt himself, a very modest man, didn't want to keep making a comment after Mises. But I would be down at the end there, and I was really, I was terribly disappointed. I thought the man was ignoring my question, you know, and I didn't realize later he couldn't even hear what I said, and he didn't want to say, "I can't hear you." It's just a little bit of vanity, which is understandable. He always, another personality thing is his dress. He never, anybody who's read this book, Margaret mentions it in there, he would never appear in public or even in private without a coat, without a jacket and tie. He was very fussy. And when he came out to the house for dinner, he'd be invited for dinner at 7 o'clock. And you knew you could be fooling around in the kitchen and the dining room, but when the doorbell rang, you look at 7 o'clock, right on the dot, just like if you've seen pictures of him in his military uniform, you know. There's one in this book. He was a really smart Prussian or Austrian officer when he was in the military. And his military preciseness and his exactness on time, in addition to coming to my house and dinner, when we go for a walk, they went to, Lou and Margaret went up in the country, up in Vermont every summer to have a little vacation. And they invite us to come up and see him. And we go up there, and we check in at a nearby inn, you know, and we go out to dinner together, and we take a walk in the woods. And you'd be walking along, and Mises would discover that he was out of step with you. And then he'd do a little flip step, he wouldn't comment. He wouldn't say anything. He'd just do it automatically, like a military man who knows he's out of step. He wouldn't ask you to get in with him. He would get in step with you. That's another example of how thoughtful and courteous he was. He would say, "Why don't you?" He didn't order me, but he was a very precise man. And when I suggested to him that I'd like to have a bust made, I had a friend who was a sculptor, and a good one. And I asked her, would you, if I gave you a commission? No, she said, for Mises, she knew who he was. She had met him at dinner parties at our house. And she said, I won't charge you anything. It's an honor for you to ask me to do it. And I said, all right, I'll ask him. So I asked Lou. He said, oh, no, I'm not. There again, you see, humility. You wouldn't have that trouble with Hayek. No way. Am I right, Professor? For example, the first Mont Pelerin meeting I attended as a guest was in Switzerland, that lovely resort hotel over the valley of the Engadine there. And Professor Hayek, for whom I have the most profound respect, of course, I never forgot the speech he made at the end of the meeting. He announced that after, this was in 1957, which is exactly 10 years after the founding of the society, he announced that he carried the burden of this presidency of this society for 10 years, and he felt it was time to lay down the reins and so on. And then he expatiated a little more on a few words, and I said to my wife, reminds me of, who was it, Mark Antony? Thrice upon the Lupercal he refused the crown, like speaking of Caesar. And after refusing it thrice, he took it. Old Hayek, he loved the limelight, no question about it. And his brother, I got a letter from his brother the other day in England, who had heard that I had a bust made of Hayek through pictures, the same way we were going to do Murray. And it turned out very well. I had my own pictures that were taken at a meeting in New York where Hayek and Mises were both present. And I had hired a photographer to cover the whole meeting. That's where some of your pictures out there were taken. But Mises said, no, I'm not interested in a bust. And Margaret, of course, she being the actress, Margaret was quite an entrepreneur of herself. I mean, she was a promoter, and it was a good thing she was. She did a lot to help her husband with her abilities to promote things. So I give her, I don't know who convinced him, probably Margaret. And he said, well, all right. Well, one thing, he thought he would have to sit. Oh, no, I can't take time from my work. Well, sculptor lady said, well, I'll come down to your office at the university, and you can just sit at your desk and keep working. And, well, all right. So that's what happened. And when the sculptor put the calipers on his head, old Mises turned red. He says he blushed like a baby. He was so embarrassed to ever stick these things in. And another thing about him that amazed me, on the wall in his apartment, you remember the old pictures of Franz Joseph, the Emperor of Austria, with the gray button chop? He had a nice picture of old Franz Joseph, his emperor, and was still hanging on the wall. Which illustrates again the difference between Mises and his student Rothbard. I can't imagine Rothbard ever hanging a picture of an emperor on the wall. But the other things that might be worth telling about him, well, I probably shouldn't tell this, but I will because it's embarrassing for myself. Being a writer and being asked sometimes to write all sorts of things, including some which were a little, not salacious, but a little naughty, Ogden Nash was an expert at that, limericks and so on. So I had dashed off something for this chap who was having a birthday party across the street. And I made the mistake when Mises came to dinner one night. I said, "What do you think of this?" or something. And of course, he assumed I had written it, which I had. I didn't mention it when I handed it to him, but he looked at it and that was his answer. So anyway, he could express his thorough disgust that I would bother with such. But there are so many things. The memories, my memory is not what it was, of course. But oh yes. Near the end of his days, when his mind was beginning to get fuzzy, we went down to dinner at the Tavern on the Green in Central Park in New York City, because I knew they were going to be playing some Viennese music and so on. And there was Mrs. Mises, of course, Margaret, and my wife and I, and I think perhaps their daughter from England was there. But Lou was sitting next to me, and the music came on. He didn't say much during the dinner because, it wasn't long before he passed on. And when the music started, he started to hum, and he started to go this way, and he was humming Viennese music. So he was a typical, as Murray has written many times, he was the quintessence of the Vienna gentleman, And I don't know whether Murray ever told you this, but they used to go, in Europe, they used to go to the opera. But when they got to New York, they had lost a lot of money and spent a lot of money on trying to get there, fleeing. Margaret tells about I titled the chapter for Flight from Europe. In fact, I titled all the chapters in her book. But she tells how difficult it was getting out of Europe. And he arrived here pretty hard up, I think. Although nobody's told me that, but that was, of course, he was a very prudent man, and he lived very humbly. I spoke to Larry Ferdy about that once. I said, "What are we going to do?" I said, "What are we going to do when Lou gets, unable to continue his work? Are we going to raise a fund?" Or Ferdy said, "Don't you worry," he said, "the old boy's all right." Well, the inference was that the old boy had made enough money in the market or in the economy to take care of himself, which I'm sure. I can say one thing about it. There was one line in his book, just one line, and when I read it, and that line was, in fact, when they did the condensation, did you ever see that little thing I did on human action? I should have brought some copies. I boiled down human action into one, not human action, but I boiled down the essence, like you concentrate orange juice, And I took the principal points of his economic philosophy, and without putting any words of mine in at all, I just took all the German construction out, reversed the sentences, I took phrases out of one sentence and added them to another to express the same thought that took him 3 or 4 sentences because of the German language. He was thinking in German and writing in English. Anyway, this little book came out, and as I was putting this book together, there was one line that hit me, which said, "The falling exchange rate predicts the coming inflation." And I read it again, and I started to think, well, I can't tell you how much that one sentence did for me, because I bought my first Swiss francs in 1957. And all I can remember is that in 1972, the Swiss franc was worth 25 cents U.S. Yesterday or the day before, it was worth 85 cents. So I can credit Professor Mises. That one sentence got me to thinking. I figured it backwards because I knew the inflation was coming, but I hadn't realized the impact of the import of the exchange rate. And when it began to, it's been sliding a long time, but of course recently it's been diving. So anyway, Lou, I didn't have to work at raising money. And Fertig, who himself was quite a wealthy man, for all I know, Fertig, I don't know whether he needed any help, but I do know that his last days were comfortable. But they never, to show you how frugal they must have been. When he came to New York, he settled in this apartment up in Upper, I don't know, any of you, Roger, you've probably been there, haven't you?
No.
Well, it was up on Central Park West, the corner of 77th Street. And it was a rent control. The anomaly is that here's a professor who's opposed to rent control. He's living in a rent control. He had to. All apartments were rent controlled at the time he moved in. And he stayed there. Never moved, never lived anywhere else as his permanent home after coming to the United States. That one apartment. And one thing I can tell about it is this must relate to his military bearing, and he walked like a military. When I was helping Margaret on this book, sometimes the first time she came out to my house in Connecticut, we sat down at the table, and she had this manuscript, and it was all right. It was interesting, but it was kind of mixed. So I told her, well, the first thing you got to do, Margaret, is get it in a chronological. You've got it in chronological order, but you jump back and forth and so on. I did said, get the chapter. Here's your chapter. Here's your chapter titles. Right here. Boom, boom, boom. She said, fine, I like them. And I said, we'll go home and work on it some more, and then we'll get together again. Well, we did, and most of the time, because of the distance involved, it was a 2-hour drive, and sometimes I had to go into New York anyway. I would wind up working at her place. And she kept saying, why don't you stay overnight? You don't have to stay overnight and work some more on the book. Let's get the book. She was a pusher. And all right, so I stayed overnight twice, and then I couldn't stay anymore because Lou Mises' bed. She said, you can sleep in Lou's bed. His bedroom, his bed was in his office, which is about little like if you squared this gnome, it wouldn't be. It would be if you cut it off here. And his bed, by golly, was like an army cot. It was a flat thing, about so wide. It went this way. God's name, did that man sleep in this bed? Maybe he slept in the bedroom where I never saw the bedroom. So presumably, but she said you can sleep in Lou's bed. She said Lou's bed. Maybe that's where he took his naps. But it was army style, I'll tell you that. I can't recall any other incidents that could bear taping. But now I'd like to add a couple of things about Murray. Murray, when we first met, we came up together on the subway quite often. I came up to catch the train up to Pelham, where I lived then. And sometimes I'd actually drive down there and park the car, and I'd drive Murray home. Not very often, a couple of times, I think. But the first time I did, he insisted, you must come up and have coffee and a piece of cake. And I met Murray's parents. Very nice people. His father worked for an oil company. Very nice. And I could tell right offhand that there was a fine family relationship, and they're pretty proud of their son even before he had achieved what he has. I could sense that. And of course, I realized I figured I knew. I didn't realize how far Murray would go, but I could certainly see the potential. And Murray and I, Joey and my wife, became good friends, and they came down. And we had another thing I learned through Mises and economics. I went down to the Virgin Islands on a vacation with no intention of buying anything. Didn't have that much to buy anyway, to buy with. A real estate man got me up on a hill overlooking the sea on two sides, St. Croix, and it was a beautiful view. And I said, how much is this 2-acre lot? He said, $16,000 right away. Well, a 100-foot lot in Pelham, New York, down the street from me, is worth about $16,000, 150 feet. And here you got 2 acres overlooking the, no snow, no slush, no train going by down the, no traffic. So I said, something's wrong with this ratio. So I said, all right. I went down and put down a down payment to hold the lot. And if I hadn't had a sense of relative values, I wouldn't have done that. If I hadn't studied what little economics I gleaned from Mises, which I consider for me quite a lot, actually. But I owe that man not only what he did for my mind, but what he did for my pocketbook. Very practical. And maybe you should put that in some of your lectures to these young guys, If you ever expect to make any money, you've got to read Human Action. But Murray came down there with Joey, and we had a wonderful time. And he sang his Cole Porter. I got out the clarinet, and I got a piano player in, and he sang Cole Porter all night. But I just, of course, I was shocked to death. Shocked, but not yet to death. But I have decided that in the allotted, if I live as long as my mother, I've got 13 years to live. Well, I don't know that I will or not. But I'm going to use most of that, all of the time that I can, to helping the cause of freedom in one way or another. And of course, with all these institutes, FEE, this one, I might add an anecdote about going to Russia with what's his name in Cato. See, my memory's going wrong. President of Cato. I heard that they were going to have a Cato seminar in Moscow, and I called up. Oh my heavens! I'm embarrassed. I can't remember the name.
Ed Crane. You're talking about Ed Crane or Bill
Crane. Yeah, Ed Crane. I called him Ed Crane. I said, Ed, how would you like to take a bust of Ludwig von Mises to Moscow and present it to the mayor? And he said, well, that's lovely. I said, well, I can get you one. I'll get you one. Well, he said, that's very nice, George, but he said, I'd rather have one of Hayek. And I said, why? Good Lord, I said, Mises was Hayek's teacher. Hayek praised Mises as his teacher. Why do you want to take... Well, he says, Hayek won the Nobel Prize. All right, if we got to do it with Hayek, we'll do it with Hayek. So I said, Hayek's on his deathbed in Germany, in Freiburg. So we can't, we'll have to try it. I'll find out if it can be done from photographs. And of course, I'm happy that it did turn out well. I'm pleased that I sponsored and helped raise the money. In fact, the Mises bust, I paid all of it. It wasn't a big deal. The Mises bust, the casting of that cost $150 back in 1950. To cast that bust today is $975. And to cast a Hayek's $1,001 or something, because Hayek bust is a little bigger. Hayek actually had a larger head than me. I won't make a pun and say in more ways than one. Having said I won't, I did. But Hayek, God bless him, he tried up to the end when he wrote that bloody book. I don't know what you think of it, The Fatal Conceit. And the interesting thing was, just about the time that we took that, I took 2 busts. I was determined to take a bust of Mises. So I went along, I crated up the bust of Hayek, and I crated up the bust of Mises, 2 of them made specially for this occasion, and got on the plane to Germany. We went from Germany to Moscow. We went from Frankfurt then on to Moscow. And we uncrated the Mises bus. In fact, we uncrated, no, that was another time, the Hayek. And I turned it over to Crane and his boys, and on the day of the presentation, in order to make the flight to Poland in time for a reception into Warsaw, they were going to give me a reception. In order to make that, I had to forego the presentation to the mayor. So Ed Crane said, "I want you to be there, and we'll present it." So I had to leave early, and I said, "I'll tell you what, I'll write you out 2 paragraphs. You can read a statement from me to the mayor, and I'll just hand it to you." And so he did. Then I got on to Warsaw, and they had they took me in Oscar Lange's study, the famous Oscar Lange, with whom Mises had a little post-mortem confrontation. But I don't know. Of course, a lot of the books were in foreign languages, and I couldn't spot them. But incidentally, I went through Keynes' private library in Cambridge, and his books, his library, private library, was 3/4 the size of this, and 90% of the books in that library were on mathematics. And I went to the King's College library shelf. And of course, there was nothing of Mises there. I think there was Hayek's, one of Hayek. I don't think it was even the Road to Serfdom. No, it wasn't. But that was King's College. I forgot what year that was. But the thing that struck me about Keynes, very few books on economics, most of them about mathematics. We had a little memorial service for Mises, a very small one, up in the cemetery where his ashes are deposited. And we had a wonderful memorial service for him in New York, and I dare say the one for Murray will be the same, and I'll be there. I think I get my plane reservations at the time. And I just can't imagine anything really new in economics. And of course, this is speaking as a non-economist. But if Rothbard, the only thing, you've probably heard the story, somebody went up to Mises one day after Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State came out and said, "Professor, you realize, of course, that Professor Rothbard has differed with you on the point of monopolistic competition and so on. What do you have to say about that?" Then Mises said, "All I have to say to you, sir, is that Professor Rothbard is a fine economist." That's another example of his humility and his intellectual purity. I mean, he just wouldn't, there was nothing, Mises never acted. His only action was all up here. Hayek was, Friedman, pretty good. Well, Friedman doesn't do too much of it, but Mises didn't have time for any of the persiflage that goes with the profession. Yet I don't know what else I can tell you, unless if you have any questions. I can't imagine that I could be able to answer them, but I would try.
Someone told me once that Mises actually owned a car, but was a terrible driver.
That's right. Yeah, he was. And in fact, thank you. That's an anecdote I've forgotten. Margaret called me. I think it was in Connecticut then. She said, "George, I have a favor to ask you." I said, "Yes." "What is it?" She said, Lou is a scholar. He's not a businessman. He's a scholar. And we have to buy a car. And I want to know what you think Is a Pontiac so-and-so a good automobile? I said, well, what do you want to do with it? Well, we don't drive far and so on. So, yeah, it's all right. He said, you'll be all right. You'll be happy with it. Well, I wanted to make sure because Lou, we talked to the man, you know, and Lou wasn't sure whether it was good. And I wasn't sure whether we'd be safe in it. But he was a bad driver. In fact, so was Margaret. I don't know what they did when they were in Austria, whether they drove.
But he owned a Pontiac? He owned a Pontiac?
Yeah. He owned one, what they owned before, they racked it up. They had a bad accident. And Lou was banged up quite a bit, I guess. This was when I was at it. I heard about it. I heard about the accident, but I didn't see any evidence of it getting banged up. You know, he might have got plenty of bruises. After all, he wasn't a young man. But he was a hardy fellow, though. His mountain climbing, they used to climb mountains. Well, he was in the mountain troops, you know, in Austria during World War I. I wonder if he ever ran into Fritz Kreisler. He was in the troops, too, in World War I. And Kreisler wrote a book about it. And it's hard, I don't know where you'd find that book anyway. I got a hold of a copy and I Xeroxed one chapter where Kreisler tells how on Christmas Day, the troops fighting on both sides got out of the trenches, went and had a cake and rum party in no man's land and so on, got along fine, jolly, and then went back and started shooting at each other. Kreisler tells us out of his own personal Fritz Kreisler.
Mr. Koether, you mentioned Toshio Murata.
What'd you say?
You mentioned Toshio Murata.
Oh, yeah.
From Japan. He's been in contact with the Institute in the last couple of years.
I would imagine, yeah. Mm-hmm.
We were glad to hear from him.
He's a very dedicated scholar and a good one. And he's got the free market economic theory right down pat.
Mr. Koether, how much time did Henry Hazlitt spend with von Mises?
Well, Henry Hazlitt was a pivotal character in the whole tale. He was in touch with Mises by mail before Mises came to America. And I think probably the only one, unless Mises had been in touch with that fairly sound economist in Columbia back in the early days.
Machler?
No, before, Machler, was he at Columbia? His name began with a B.
Beckhart? Benjamin Beckhart?
No. He goes way back. This is back in early 1900, 1920, back in there. Another thing I forgot that's right. I forgot to tell you. This was interesting about Mises. The first seminar, he mentioned, well, I didn't mention all the three books. The first book he said, now you should all read the Introduction to Logic and Scientific Method. That's by Cohen, who was quite a logician. Wrote several books on logic and philosophy. I think Cohen was at City College at the time. That's the first book you should get. Then the next book was, when we got into money, you should read Lombard Street by Bagehot. And I ran out, and every time he mentioned a book, I'd run right out to the used bookstore and get a hold of it. That's how I built my library on the books that he mentioned. And I still have my copy of Lombard Street, and that book bears rereading right now in view of what's going on in world monetary markets. That's a fantastic book, in which Bagehot says, I have described the financial manipulations that go on with the Bank of England in Lombard Street, and I disapprove of them entirely, but I must confess I don't see any hope. He said that before Hayek's Constitutional Liberty came out. And if you happen to read, there was a review, Mises did a review of Constitution of Liberty for the Christian paper called Christian Economics, which I fought tooth and nail to try to change it. I was one of the first ones hired by the foundation to publish Christian economics. I said, look at this. Economics is economics. It's not Christian, it's not Jewish, it's not Muslim, it's economics. And you're gonna put a bad label on it. Well, I know, but this is going to ministers, it's going to weird, and I'm going to interpret the Bible. Hey, I'm going to get stories out of the Bible to illustrate the market and so on. We got to call it Christian. Okay, I can't fight Wall Street. Only this time it was the Sun Oil Company. This foundation was bankrolled by J. Howard Pugh, the famous Sun Oil, with 2 or 3 brothers, I think. And so we call it Christian economics. Well, out comes constitutional liberty, and the head of the foundation, Kirshner, he, I imagine he asked Lou to write a review of it. I doubt that Lou would have. Lou did. Maybe, I don't know. At any rate, I know it was published. And Mises paid many compliments all through his review, and then did his little intellectual demonstration of his intellectual honesty by saying, however. And you could tell that he was gentrifying his writing to be gentle to Hayek. I could see that if he were talking personally to some close friend, he'd say, but the way I could just sense the way he worded this thing, he soft-chewed his criticism at this one point. I forgot what it is now. But otherwise, it was praising the book all through. It was 2 volumes, I think, wasn't it? Constitutional Liberty? I think so.
This one.
Just one? I'm confusing.
What did Mises think of Ayn Rand?
Oh, God, that's another. We were walking down the street one day, and I said something about Rand. I told him I'd been out to Hollywood to be interviewed by the great Cecil B. DeMille for a job running his Right to Work Foundation. And I look at this. And while I was there, I was in the home of Herb Cornell, who was Leonard Read's number 2 man when they started the Foundation for Economic Education. And being in Hollywood and being in Herb Cornell's home, with Ayn Rand out there in the Paramount studio writing for Paramount, I said, this was after the famous Atlas Shrugged had been published. I said, Ayn Rand's over here. I said, I thought I might drop in and see what she sounds like. I read her book. He said, why don't you call her up? He says, I've got her home phone number. Oh, I said, all right, I'll call her up and make an appointment. So I called up from his home that very evening, at 6 o'clock in the evening. And she answered, hello. I said, Miss Rand? Yes. I said, you don't know me, but I'm calling you from Herb Cornell's home. My name is George Koether. I'm a journalist. I don't know you. What is your name? He repeated. He said, how do I know you're not a communist? That was enough for me. I was going to take that guffer, slam the phone down. Well, the name must have gotten through to her somehow, because she starts showing up at the Mises seminars when they were held in Gallatin House, which was the home of the former Secretary of the Treasury years ago, Gallatin, on Washington Square, one of those nice old homes. And the room was smaller than the room in New York University, but the table was beautiful. It must have been Mr. Gallatin's original antique furniture. It was an antique now. And it's an oval table again. Mises at this end, and this time I'm right next to him. And right across the table, who's glaring at me but Ayn Rand? And I saw her come in. I spotted her right away for her picture recording. So I thought, well, I'm not going to give this dame a nod of my head. All the other people in the seminar, but I ran. So I walked right by her, didn't even look at her, sat down, and she's right across from me. I still didn't look at her. And every now and then I turn over and I try to catch her, look at her out of the corner of my eye, she'd be glaring at me. I was not recognizing her importance, and she didn't like that. But Mises said one day, I said, what do you think of Ayn Rand? He says, well, he says, one thing, she's no philosopher. She's no philosopher. Again, he said it gently, you know, instead of unloading on her, which I would have done. I was like, you mean that's true? That and everything, her famous speech on money, and that was struck, which is the only part of the book worth reading. And that long speech, it's a tour de force. It's really worth reading because she includes in that speech the concept of the morality of money, that you can tell where the morality of a country is by its money. And it's that simple. Gold is real money, gold and silver, but especially gold. No, not silver. It was silver and was in India, but the difference between real money and phony money and credit money and checks and the rest of it, he could have unloaded on Rand, but I'm sure he would love that. I'm sure he didn't take time to read it. But that speech on money, and it was all Misesian, all philosophy of money, the whole thing was. So somewhere she learned it along the way, I don't know, but she must have learned something from Mises. She must have been reading a lot of Mises before she came to the seminar. Whether she's done in the net, whether she's done more harm than good, or who knows. She certainly followed up a couple of lives I know about, and she certainly seems to have followed up our chairman of the Federal Reserve. He was supposedly a great ardent devotee of hers, disciple, and he's not acting like ever since he got into government, you see. Well, thank you very much. I've talked too much, too long. I don't know how useful anything was.